Welcome everyone. In this video, we are just going to begin with some basic ideas in the course, beginning logic, just to make sure you are in the right place. This is Philosophy 106, beginning logic. In the first week, we are going to be exploring really just some of the fundamentals of introductory logic, beginning right from the first chapter of our Stanley Baronet textbook, the title of which is What Logic Studies. So in the first couple of PowerPoints here, we're just going to be learning some of the basic building blocks of what makes an argument. Logic really is the study of argument and argumentation. So as I'm going to explore throughout the video, you'll perhaps already understand that all of us use logic when we're making arguments in everyday life. But perhaps not all of us know what those specific details are that make an argument a strong or a weak argument. And so really the first couple of weeks of the course is just to familiarize ourselves with what actually counts as an argument. So what is logic study? Logic is a very abstract branch of philosophy that has many different components, but what it really studies, as I mentioned, are arguments and statements. We're going to have to differentiate a bit. A statement and an argument, they actually are not the same thing. And really what logic as a branch of philosophy is interested in is the science of argument, or the validity of argument. What makes an argument worthy of believing? What makes an argument persuasive? There are much stronger and weaker arguments out there in the world, and a lot of arguments really are not very valid at all. So we're going to have to learn what counts as a valid argument. So as I say before, the first week or so is going to be learning how to recognize an argument when we see it, both in everyday life as well as in terms of the underlying structure of an argument. All right, and so as we move into formal logic, we will come to understand that there are ways of, in a way, taking an X-ray of the underlying skeleton, as it were, of an ordinary argument that we would typically make. And when we take that X-ray, we can see what the deep structure of the argument is. We are going to differentiate arguments and explanations. Often explanations do sound like arguments. They have a kind of an argumentative machinery to them, an argumentative force, but actually an explanation is different than an argument. An explanation is not necessarily trying to persuade us of anything, but rather is trying to, explain or illuminate why a certain event has taken place in the way it has taken place. So section C will be an attempt to clarify arguments by contrasting arguments with explanations. In section D, we are going to explore the connection between truth and logic. And this is a very big question that philosophers have spent thousands of years pondering. If arguments are statements that we're trying to build in order to persuade us about something, presumably that something is meant to be true. We are trying to be sold on the idea that a certain reality, a certain fact of the world is in fact true. However, we're going to very quickly come to understand that logic can evaluate the structure of arguments without necessarily thinking about whether or not those arguments are true. And these are actually different exercises and different components of what logic and logicians study. Okay, so we're going to have to explore a little bit what it means to do a truth analysis, to think about whether or not arguments are really true, and to think about whether or not just the structure of arguments are any good. Okay, they're actually very different questions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. This is going to get more detailed than I can really address here, but just suffice to say that really logic is going to be divided between different types of arguments, and the most important of those types are first deductive arguments, which we're going to be more interested in general throughout this course. But there are also a whole range of what we could call inductive arguments that are more regularly used in everyday life. Okay, and these types of arguments, deductive and inductive, have very different structures and different properties that are worth accounting for. Deductive arguments is going to be a branch of logic that we're going to spend really the great majority of the course considering, and it's going to bring us into a consideration of what is known as validity. The concept of validity really has to do with the integrity or the formal structure of the argument in question. And validity is going to be distinguished from truth, from the truth content of the specific premises and claims that the argument is making. So we'll explore this idea quite a bit more, but suffice it to say for now that validity is going to be a very, very kind of crucial, important aspect of deductive argumentation. Inductive arguments are not really going to be arguments that ask us to consider validity as much as their strength. And by strength, we really mean their persuasiveness, their likelihood of being true. So inductive arguments really have to do with strength and truth. I know this is a lot of verbiage up front, and I do want to emphasize that when I'm introducing these kinds of labels, these proper nouns, it can be very easy to be confused, to be discouraged, and that's because logic really only starts clicking when you see concrete examples of these types of things on the ground, and when we really start solving logical problems. All right, so don't be too discouraged if this menu is not clicking right away. I promise it will click eventually. Okay, so logic, as I was saying before, is a very abstract topic. It can get very symbolic, almost mathematical, almost algebraic, but really logic just has to do with the structure of argumentation, and argumentation has to do with reasoning, or what we would call critical reasoning, which is something that hopefully each of us do every day. So I'm just going to provide some very sort of mundane examples of what we would call critical reasoning. If I have a thought like this, which perhaps we've all had, should I wake up early to eat before my morning class, or sleep more, but get to lunch until noon? Okay, this, on the face of it, does not seem like a particularly abstract or enlightened thought process, but really there is a thought process here involved. So each of us every single day makes, who knows how many thousands of little calculations actually that are cognitive and involve some form of reasoning. So it's all the more inducement, all the more reason for us to get really good at sharpening our critical reasoning skills and learning how to sort out the difference and evaluate the difference between a strong and a weak argument. Here's another example. Should I get another job so I can buy a car, or use the time to study for my biology exam? Okay, again, on the face of it, not particularly profound, not particularly abstract. However, a very ordinary problem that any one of us can relate to that does involve a bit of reasoning. And by reasoning, we mean we have to evaluate the strength or weakness of reasons. We have to evaluate the likelihood of certain outcomes, the desirability of certain outcomes. And so really the stuff of life is filled with critical reasoning. So why wouldn't you want to tighten up and sharpen your critical reasoning and learn as many tools as you can to make rational decisions at every level of life? So we are going to, in part, spend a lot of time thinking about what would count as good or effective critical reasoning and what would count as ineffective or fallacious critical reasoning. We will devote at least a whole chapter to that material. So in section A, 1A of our book, Baronet, the writer of the textbook, walks us through in pretty step-by-step detail the building blocks of an argument. What is an argument? We all probably have an ordinary kind of everyday understanding of when someone is arguing. Usually it involves some use of reason making, reason giving that is trying to twist our arm into doing something we wouldn't ordinarily do, or to believe something we wouldn't ordinarily believe. So in order to kind of differentiate arguments from perhaps other kinds of elements of our language, we'll begin with the definition of a statement. So, by the way, in these PowerPoints, when I am introducing new technical vocabulary as outlined in our book, I will always embolden the term in question. All right, so you can kind of follow along. Also, I do try to go pretty slowly through these PowerPoints since it's a lot of material. If you get frustrated by how slow, I'm sorry. I think it's better to really go slowly, even if you understand what I'm already saying. If, however, the videos turn out to be too fast for you, you can always go back, retrace your material, watch again. But also, each one of these technical terms is listed in our index in the textbook, so you can always look them up. And pretty much my wording is very, very close to Baronet's wording. So what is a statement? A statement is a sentence that makes a claim. Okay, so a statement really is what we could call an utterance, or something that is being pronounced that refers to something in the world, right? And usually we take for granted that that statement is trying to be more or less an accurate description of the thing in the world. So we, in logic, like to use this term truth value. Truth value means that there is a relationship between the sentence in question and the world, and that relationship is more or less meant to be accurate, that the statement in question is more or less accurately depicting things as they really do exist in the world. All right, this is already getting us into some fairly heady philosophical waters in terms of what does it mean to really say something that is true. That is a huge debate throughout the history of philosophy, but we all have sort of an automatic, everyday understanding of what it means to say something that's true, right? So to further refine the concept of truth value means a statement that is either true or false. True or false. I should sort of flag this concept here because in this course, in Introductory Logic, we are going to be working with what is known as a binary system. So statements are either true or false. False or true. As we know in everyday life, this is not always the case. There can be statements that really are either true or false, but then there are all kinds of complex statements about the world that are not necessarily either true or false. They could have some gray area or some undecidability about them. Logicians really hate the gray area. We really want things to be black and white. We want truth and falsehood to be kind of like, I'm often describing it as an on and off switch. If something is true, we can flick that switch off and it becomes false, and vice versa. So the system we are working with is binary. If that bothers you, you're in good company. It bothers me too. I don't think a lot of our statements in the world really are this cut and dry, but logic kind of needs them to be cut and dry for reasons that I think you will end up seeing as we explore throughout the course. So let's compare some statements. Is the door open? Now, I just want to ask you about this. Is this a statement or not? Would you characterize this as a statement for yourself? Try to think about whether the linguistic unit, is the door open, a statement or not. Really, this is a question, right? And a question can't really be thought of as a statement. A statement is a little bit more direct and forceful. A statement really is saying something that has a truth value. A question is more open-ended than that, right? The door could be open or it could be closed. Now, if you look behind me, you can see that if I'm referring to this door here, unless I'm creating some kind of optical illusion, this door is closed. But that doesn't change the circumstance that this statement is a question, not a statement, in the technical sense of the term. Okay? Close the door now. Is that a statement? Close the door now. Let's assume that this door is open and you're in the room with me and I say, close the door now. Is that a statement? You're probably hearing that this sentence is really a command. I'm telling you to do something. This can be a little tricky because some statements might sound very commanding in the sense that they are persuasive. They're giving a reason, but commands don't really have a truth value. They're not really things that are asking us to consider whether or not the sentence is adequately syncing up with something in reality. They're just trying to tell us to do something, right? And our lives are filled, unfortunately, with commands. But commands tend not to have a truth value, and so logic tends not to really study them all that closely. The door is open. Now think about this last sentence. The door is open. Regardless of whether or not this sentence is true or false, think about whether or not it counts as a statement as we have defined it. A statement, again, is a sentence that makes a claim. If you said statement, you are correct. This is a statement. It happens, in my case, to be a false statement, right? You can see that my door is closed. However, it's still a statement because it is referring to something in the world, and the sentence has a truth value. It could be true or it could be false. In this case, it's false, but it's still a statement that is making a claim about something real in the world. Okay, so arguments often are going to build off of statements. All right, so let's get a little bit further into the weeds here with argument and have a look at the technical definition that our textbook has given of the term. Arguments establish support for the truth of a claim. Arguments contain premises in support of a conclusion. Okay, so each one of these definitions we're going to have to unpack a little bit further, but let's have a look at the first one a little bit more carefully. Arguments establish support for the truth of a claim. Okay, so already in this definition, you can kind of sense that arguments are advancing something that has a truth value, right? They are trying to make the case for some state of affairs in the world. And I just kind of ask you to think about, before we explore it further, what it means to establish support for truth. What would support mean? Perhaps if you're reading a book of history, you will find support for truth claims in the form of documents and evidence and archives. Maybe if you're watching the news and someone comes up on the news and tries to persuade you that a certain drug is not safe, that news anchor will provide all kinds of negative stories about people becoming sick from the drug, right? So support is offered in order to defend the, let's be a little weird here and call it the truthiness of the argument, right? Support means providing reasons for believing the truth of the claim. And then to look at the second component here, contains premises in support of a conclusion. So we're going to have to get into what a premise means quite a bit, because that's going to be one of the key pieces of this puzzle here. But suffice it to say for the moment that arguments have parts, right? They're moving from simple statements up to conclusions. And conclusions are really where the person making the argument is trying to tie it all together and really persuade you of something, right? So, you can think about this just in terms of writing a paper in an English class, right? You're always taught to have a conclusion that brings it all together, shows the reader what it is you think you have persuaded them of, right? So arguments really have all of these parts. Some arguments are extremely short and simple, and some arguments go on for thousands of pages, right? There's really no specific shape an argument has to take, but they do seem to have these components. Establish support for the truth of a claim, and they have premises in support of a conclusion. Okay, so let's look at some examples. We should boycott that company. They've been found guilty of producing commodities that they knew were dangerous and that caused injuries. Okay, so this is kind of a multi-part argument, right? Or at least there are little different bits of information here that we can sort out. And so I just ask you to kind of reread this and maybe try to identify some of the reasons that are being offered in support of the ultimate claim, which is that we should boycott this company, whatever the company is, right? All right, so what is given in support of this idea we should boycott the company? All right, so let's look at this technical term, premise. We're going to be talking about premises over and over and over again throughout the class. Premises are, like the staple of logic. Premises are really, really important building blocks in every argument. Every argument has them. So the technical definition of a premise is the information intended to provide support for the conclusion. Okay, so any statement, any claim that is given to us that is supplying us with what we need to believe that conclusion. Premises can be true and they can be false. We're not necessarily going to be evaluating whether or not the premise is true or false because we're more often going to be just looking at the internal structure of arguments. But premises are offered with the hope that they're saying something true about the world in order to get you to believe this conclusion. Okay, so arguments make claims that build from the information contained in the premises. So premises are, kind of like the pages of a book, right? They are little bits of information that all come together to form the book that is ultimately bound together to persuade you of some state of affairs in the world. All right, so premises are these little initiating bits of information collected in such a way that you are going to ultimately believe the conclusion that is provided. All right, so arguments consist of premises. Premises provide us with information that are not just random, but are offered in order to get us to buy in to the ultimate conclusion of the argument. Now, what's a conclusion? In a way, the conclusion is the most important thing of all. The conclusion is where we tie everything together, right? The conclusion is that final statement that is claimed to follow from the premises of an argument. Now, I want you to think about the language here in this definition. Statement that is claimed to follow from the premises. What does it mean to say that the statement follows from the premise? That is a very logical way of thinking about the ordering of arguments, right? Premises are not meant to just be random, haphazard bits of information that get us nowhere. Rather, they are meant to have a kind of logical progression, a kind of a flow, if you will, that once accepted leads us to buy into the truth of that argument, right? So conclusions are that final little moment that flows from the information given in the premises. Okay. just to linger over this a little moment, there are going to be a lot of different ways throughout the course of evaluating whether or not conclusions really do follow from premises. Sometimes in life, it will seem as though a conclusion is following logically from premises, but is actually not. Some sleight of hand has occurred, or some misfiring has happened in the logical ordering of conclusions and premises. And we're going to become very good, I hope, at being able to identify when a conclusion really does follow from premises and when it does not. Okay, so that's going to be one of the goals of the course. Now, if we move forward and look at section 1b of the book, identifying arguments, we're going to learn how to pick up on the parts of a sentence that indicate the technical terms within an argument, that is, to pick up on statements, premises, and conclusions. So the English language is actually very good at providing us little indicators or little signposts of when our premises are happening and when our conclusions are happening. And the better we can get at learning these indicators, the easier it will become to identify the parts of an argument. So let's look at an example. Here's an argument. Since they have been found guilty of producing commodities that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, we should therefore boycott that company. This is kind of a similar argument to the previous one, but I want you to think about for a moment what part of this argument is premise and which one is a conclusion. Since they have been found guilty of producing commodities that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, we should therefore boycott that company. What is a premise and what is a conclusion? I would encourage you just to kind of, if you have notes out, jot down the premises and the conclusion. Okay. Well, before moving on here, I just want to indicate, following our terms highlighted here, since is a really good indication of a premise. Since is kind of one of those flagship terms that is usually intended to just signal to the reader that a premise is coming, that some statement is coming with information that is being offered in support of a conclusion. So everything that is following this since is really a premise. They've been found guilty of producing commodities that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries. Those are kind of, if we were to really get persnickety, those are two premises, but they're kind of being offered as one here. And then we'll notice this final clause, which has the highlighted therefore. We should therefore boycott that company. Therefore is a very surefire indication of a conclusion. It's a very wrap up, look what I got kind of word that English loves to use. You've probably been taught to use therefore in English papers or in history papers. And indeed, therefore will often provide an indication of the conclusion. So the conclusion of this argument is we should boycott the company, right, for the reasons that were provided. Now, this is a very long list, and I don't want you to have the feeling that you have to memorize this necessarily, but it is a very good idea to become acquainted with the types of words that indicate conclusions and the types of words that ordinarily indicate premises. You will notice with conclusions, it's a lot of words that have the sound of wrapping up a thought, right? Therefore, we talked about consequently is a very big, high indication of conclusion. It proves that. That's sort of a clunkier phrase we don't see as often. In conclusion, of course, is a dead giveaway that the conclusion is following that clause. So very, very high frequency indicator. Okay, so have a look over that list of conclusion indicators. And then on the right, note the premise indicators. Premise indicators tend to have a kind of causal sense to them. Words like because, assuming that as indicated by, since these are very high frequency indications of a premise. The author of the argument is indicating to you, is trying to point to you that the information following that term is information you need to buy into the truth of the conclusion, right? So the fact that, for the reasons that it follows from, these are all very strong premise indicators that our language uses all the time. Okay, so get in the habit of, when looking at these informal, ordinary, everyday arguments, underlining the premise indicators and underlining the conclusion indicators. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. Whoops, kind of covering this up here. Buy an Apple instead of a Windows computer because Apple computers have more features for graphic artists and you are a graphic artist. All right. Maybe reread the sentence. It's a little clunky to me, actually, what's being said here, and start to think about premises and conclusions. So what are the premises? We have one premise: Apple computers have more graphic features for graphic artists, right? This occurs in the, whoops, I keep blowing myself up here. This premise occurs in this clause, right? Apple computers have more features for graphic artists. And then B, premise B, you are a graphic artist. Okay, so I want you to notice something here. The premises in this argument are actually being offered after the conclusion. The premises are actually being supplied after the conclusion is stated. So arguments can come in that order, right? The conclusion does not have to come last. This can be a little confusing for initiates into informal logic because when we're really studying arguments, we're going to be trying to move that conclusion to the last part of the structure to see if it follows in a logical way from the premises. But just note that in ordinary language, we do all kinds of things with the order of premises and conclusions. So be aware of those indicator terms: therefore, so, since, which one is an indicator and which one is a conclusion, right? That'll really orient you towards which part of the argument is being supplied. Whoops, did not mean to move past our conclusion here. So what is the conclusion? Buy an Apple instead of a Windows computer, right? So this is actually the very first clause of the sentence, right? So that conclusion can come right away. There's nothing stopping English from supplying the conclusion first. However, this argument is a pretty good one because it still supplies premises that contain information that are offered in support of the truth of that final claim. All right, we just had to sort of rearrange things in order to see how the premises stack on and develop into the conclusion. Okay, here is another example. I do not mean to cover our example. Okay, and now I'm really covering the example. Okay, you should buy an iPod instead of a notebook. You should also buy a Honda instead of a Toyota and a Vizio television instead of a Sony. All right, now let's think about this. You'll notice the lack of indicator terms, right? You will notice no therefore, no since, no because, no so. So all of that should sort of give you a little bit of an alarm bell that this may not be an argument at all, right? This is not an argument. This is just kind of a string of recommendations or commands even, right? No argumentation is here in the sense that no reasons are really given for buying an iPad or a Toyota or any of these products, right? It's just kind of asserted that you should do this rather than that. Arguments are different in that reasons are always provided in support of the conclusion, right? So just be careful with this because not every sentence in the language is an argument. In other words, arguments require a certain structure, and that structure has a kind of form in which premises that contain information build and lead us into the truth of the conclusion. This sentence does not do that, right? These statements do not offer support for the truth of their claims, and so really they're just claims strung together. Actually, a lot of advertising does this. It thinks it's kind of arguing something, but really it's just sort of bopping you over the head with a bunch of claims. Okay. So we're going to get increasingly good at being able to spot not only the parts of argument, but differentiating arguments from non-arguments. And this is an example of a non-argument. All right. Now, this gets a little tricky distinguishing arguments from explanations, because explanations often sound like arguments, and they are oriented towards clarification, which arguments can be. Explanations are different from arguments in that arguments are not really proving things. They are providing reasons for believing or for being persuaded. An explanation often is a causal kind of claim, right? It's interested in sorting out the phenomena of an event in a manner that illuminates something that was previously unknown. So use because to provide reasons for how an event occurred. All right, so arguments are much more invested in the chain of events rather than a kind of retroactive explanation. All right, so this is a little hard to sort out unless you see examples, but let's have a comparison. Because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. All right, compare this with your back injury occurred because you lifted weights without first getting a physical checkup. Which one of these statements is an argument and which one is an explanation? Try to think about, based on what we know about arguments so far, which one would fall under the category argument and which one is merely an explanation. So let's look. If we kind of take this first clause as a premise, because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. So this first example is an argument, right? It's not certain that a certain set of events will transpire, but it is, in a way, making a case for the likelihood that a certain set of events will transpire. We'll talk about the structure of inductive arguments in greater detail in the next video. But suffice it to say for now that inductive arguments often will be appealing or attempting to rest the truth of their claims on the likelihood of some future scenario. All right. So we have a because, which is a very high frequency premise indicator, and then a kind of appeal to probability. You will injure your back. Now, this claim is not a prophecy about that guarantees that you will injure your back. It is saying the likelihood is going up, and that's an argument. The argument can still turn out to be false. There's nothing guaranteeing that it will be true, but it has a kind of rationale to it, right? The premises are offered in support of the conclusion. Now, if we look at that second example, your back injury occurred because you lifted weights without first getting a physical checkup. This is an explanation, not an argument. Now, often medicine will be providing explanations, and they're useful. This is not to say, explanations are irrelevant to everyday life. They really are. Science is in the business of providing explanations, but this is information given on the basis of an already accepted fact. It's not building premises in support of a conclusion as much as it is, in a way, trying to reverse engineer a conclusion to fit premises that are already established. Okay. Now, again, the explanations are very important, but logic is studying something very different. It is studying argument, and arguments are not so much building off of already accepted facts as they are trying to make the case for the truth of a conclusion on the basis of the structural ordering of certain premises. Okay, so suffice to say for now that we typically will not be looking at the structure of explanations as much as arguments throughout the course. All right, so let's look at just another example here. The digital camera on sale today at Cameras Galore has 5 megapixels and costs $200. The digital camera on sale at Camera Warehouse has 4 megapixels and it costs $150. You said that you do not want to spend over $175 for a camera, so you should buy the one at Camera Warehouse. So the first thing you should highlight or be aware of is our conclusion indicator, the word so, right? That word so should indicate to you that the conclusion follows. You should buy the one at Camera Warehouse. You should buy that camera. So once we have that conclusion highlighted, and I encourage you to write it down, now go back and try to find the premises that are offered in supply or in support of that conclusion. The conclusion I have highlighted here in green. You should buy the one at Camera Warehouse. All right, so we have our indicator and we have our conclusion. Now let's look at the premises. The premises are kind of jammed together, so it's a good idea to try to isolate them into discrete parts. The digital camera on sale today at Cameras Galore has 5 megapixels and costs $200. The digital camera on sale at Camera Warehouse has 4 megapixels and it costs $150. You said that you did not want to spend over $175 for a camera. Okay, so if we kind of look here, we'll notice that each one of these sentences is being offered up in order that you are persuaded of the conclusion. You should buy the one at Camera Warehouse. Taken together, we're given the information that we have this one camera over here that's out of your price range and this one camera over here that's not out of your price range. Okay, so that's essentially what the sentence is trying to get you to grasp. So arguments have what we call a reasoning process, meaning that there's a connection, a logical connection, between the premises and the conclusion. These premises are not just random or haphazardly given. We don't have premises referring to the date in which they were manufactured. Each one of those premises is sort of connecting you up with the conclusion that that the arguer, as it were, is trying to bend you towards, right? So you should think of every argument as having a kind of a flow to it, right? The information is being provided in a way that flows naturally or logically to the conclusion, right? And so we're going to have to sharpen and refine our ability to really discern and pick up whether or not premises are flowing in that natural way, particularly when it might be premises that, is given information about things in the world that we don't really know much about, right? There is actually a technique for, sort of bracketing out the question of whether or not those premises are actually accurate bits of information or not. Okay, we'll talk about that more when we get into truth analysis, but just try to understand for the moment that arguments have this kind of logical flow to them. All right, so I want to kind of break down an argument a little bit more schematically, and you'll notice that as a pattern in the class, we're going to be moving from ordinary sentences, which can be very kind of haphazard and badly organized, towards very schematic and well-organized arguments. Logic loves order and binary kind of thinking and things that are clean and elegant. Even though, most of our reasoning in everyday life is not that clean and elegant. So let's begin with a kind of a premise. Premise 1, I'm going to number these. When it is cold outside, I never go to logic class. Premise 2, if I don't go to class, my grade will suffer. All right, so we have 2 premises, and now we add a third. It has been cold outside for 2 months. Okay, we have 3 premises. Now I want you to kind of try to anticipate, to guess what the conclusion will be, more or less, based on the information provided in these premises. Try to write it down for yourself. If you have something like this, my grade is going to suffer this semester, you're right. You'll notice that the premises are all pointing us in the direction of my grade suffering. Why? Well, we know that I don't go to logic when it's cold. We know that when I don't go to class, my grade goes down, and we know that it's cold. So all of this has a kind of necessity that is forcing us into the position of number 4. My grade is going to suffer. All right, so we'll talk about how premises are trying to, in a sense, determine the direction of the conclusion in this way that is really necessary and, without alternative. But just notice for the moment that we have this horizontal line here between the last premise, point 3, and the conclusion, point 4. We are going to use that notation throughout the class. We're going to use the horizontal line to partition off the part of the argument containing the premises from the conclusion. All right, so conclusions will always come after that horizontal line. It's a very standard and accepted way of notating logic so that we are clear on which parts are which. Okay, so we have our premises in lines 1 through 3, and then we have our conclusion after that horizontal line in point 4. Now, the line itself, or rather the move from premise 3 to the conclusion, point 4, is known in logic as an inference. An inference is really that final leap of logic that we make that yields the conclusion. An inference, you've probably heard the word in ordinary speech, is really the connection that bridges the information in the premises to the conclusion. Inferences are key aspects of logic that allow us to supply that final bit of reasoning known as the conclusion. So we're going to have to explore the properties of inferences quite a bit to get a real grasp on it. But just note for now that the inference is that bridging point between the premises and the conclusion. So the inference is the bridge between premise and conclusion. It is known as a reasoning process or a mental connection that kind of glues the premises to the conclusion together. Now, the line, as I mentioned before, is always going to be the indication of the inference, right? It is going to partition off the premises from the conclusion. We will always be using that nice horizontal line. So there should be no ambiguity regarding which part of the argument is a premise and which part is a conclusion. The less ambiguity that we have to work with, the better. Logic hates ambiguity, it hates gray area, it likes things nice and schematic and mapped at, because the operations we're going to end up doing get very complex. And so we need to orient ourselves in a way that is very free of ambiguity. We're going to be talking about this quite a bit more over the next few weeks, but formal analysis is really the study of the quality of the inferences in arguments, right? So formal analysis pertains to the quality of the inferential bridge between the premise and the conclusion. So as I mentioned previously in the video, there can be times when a conclusion is supplied in relation to a premise that is not actually in support of the premise, or rather the premises do not support the conclusion. And we're going to try to study and really focus in on when a conclusion doesn't actually follow in an inferential manner from the premises. Maybe it's just tacked on there. Maybe it's random. We're going to get quite good at being able to determine whether or not that conclusion really is an inferential leap from the information supplied in the premises. So formal analysis is the study or the focused inquiry into whether or not the inference given is a good one, whether or not the inference really does mean that the premises of the argument is connecting up with the conclusion in a manner that is logical. All right, we're going to explore that formal analysis in a great deal more detail, but I just want you to sort of, I guess, hold it in your back pocket as an important thing that we're going to be on the lookout for. So the strength with which the premises supports the conclusion could be known as the formal analysis of inference. Okay, that is actually kind of a lot. So I'm just going to recap in basic terms what we have covered in this introduction. What is an argument? We have learned that arguments establish support for the truth of a claim. An argument is not just a random string of sentences. It is oriented towards truth, and it supplies information in support of that truth. Arguments contain premises, which are statements that have information in support of a conclusion. Arguments contain premises or information that support a conclusion. Premises are statements with a truth value. A premise refers to something in the world. The premise has information, and that information is either true or it is false. There's no kind of in-between truth or false. There's no gray area. It is either true or false, so it has a truth value. Conclusions are statements that are claimed to follow from premises. Conclusions are statements that are claimed to follow from premises. The bridge connecting up the information of the premises with the conclusion is known as an inference. And we're going to be exploring through formal analysis what would count as a good or strong inferential flow from a weak or not very logical inferential flow in the coming videos. So before you move on, make sure you understand in basic outline argument, premise, conclusion, truth value, and inference. That's all for now. And we will be getting a little bit more further into the details of deduction and induction next time.